All right, everyone, welcome to The New Default. It's a new podcast featuring me, Michael Shank, and Lindsay X. We're going to introduce ourselves and what inspires us to do this podcast. Why another podcast, they say. But hear us out. We've got a good new idea that we want to bring to you. So I'm Michael Shank. I go by he, him, his pronouns. Who are you, Lindsay?
Hi, Michael. Good day, everyone. My name is Lindsay X, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am proud to stand on the land of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho peoples.
Yeah, and I'm over here in Vermont on the unceded land of the Abenaki. And I'm drinking my coffee. It's nice and early for both of us. It's what time over there in your part of the world?
It is 6:10 a.m. here in Colorado.
Yeah,
I am a morning person.
I don't know how you do it. This is our radio drive. If you're driving this morning listening to our podcast, welcome. I've got my coffee. Hopefully I won't chew the ice too loud. So what inspires us to do this podcast? Well, I'll give my take and then Lindsay will give hers. So we obsess in our daily jobs about what inspires people to take action on climate. And I recently kind of took up this new discipline to post on LinkedIn every day a new sustainability story, a new positive solution about what people are doing. And we need positive stories. We need new ideas because people are definitely overwhelmed by the climate science, climate data, blah, blah, blah. And so we thought we'd come together, and Lindsay and I love chatting about this work and working together in this space. And so we thought, hey, why don't we come together and offer up some fun analysis, not just like, the hard-hitting deep dive stuff, but like some fun analysis of what's out there and what's working and what could work better, and our take on how to improve these solutions so that they're easy to do, so that they become the new default. And frankly, honestly, I came to this just because I need more fun in my life, and I knew that chatting with Lindsay would be more fun. So really, it's selfish for me. Yes, there's some altruistic reasons here, but really, it's selfish.
Oh, Michael, I love that. As Michael mentioned, in our day jobs, I get to lead up the environmental services work for the great city of Fort Collins, Colorado, about an hour and a half north of Denver.
Fort Collins.
For me, this podcast I agree with Michael. My core values as a human are optimism and connection. I truly believe that we get further together, and I want this podcast to be where anyone and everyone can find something for them. And so I'm so excited to be doing this with Michael. And I'm inspired every day by the solutions that I see on the ground that all of us in North America and across the globe are taking to make a difference.
Wow. Yes. And as Lindsay's friend, I would definitely attest to her optimism. She brings it. In my role with the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance and the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, we'll throw some links in the podcast so you can check out those organizations. Fort Collins is a member of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. I've had the opportunity to work with Lindsay and her colleagues at Fort Collins. Fort Collins is doing some amazing work, but what was clear to me early is that Lindsay is bringing the kind of energy that we need in this space. And so as you get to know Lindsay throughout this podcast, I know that you'll be equally inspired by her and her work and the work that Fort Collins is doing. So do check them out. So today we're going to do some reviewing. We're going to check out this Inflation Reduction Act, which just became law, passed the Senate and the House, and the president signed it this week. So we're going to do a little fun dive into some of that and how that becomes the new default for Americans. So Lindsay, curious if you want to give your take on kind of the current state of things where we're at. We're going to look at one component of the Inflation Reduction Act, specifically electric vehicles, because they've been talked about a lot. And certainly one party noted that only the rich get to take advantage of this incentive, this tax incentive, et cetera. So we're going to take a look at EVs, the EV component, the electric vehicle component of the Inflation Reduction Act, and do some analysis on that. Does that sound good, everyone? If there was a call and response, that's where I'd be like, yeah. Or we could put some audio in where the fake audience track is like, yeah. We could try that. All right, yeah, Lindsay, your take.
I love that, Michael. And absolutely, we want to be relevant to our listeners. And everybody this week is talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're going to do a deeper dive, like Michael said. But first off, before we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, what do we know about the current state before we start talking about what could become the new default,
Oh,
right?
I feel like we need a new jingle here. Like when you say current state, Lindsay, like there's a little jingle that we add here. So we'll have to, folks. This is our first go at it, and welcome to our inaugural podcast. But we're just thinking through. So we'll have to add a little jingle when you say current state. It'll be like, oh, or something, right? Yeah. Okay.
So you'll get the optimism from me, y'all, and you'll get the side critique from Michael.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So folks, here's what we know, right? So according to the EPA, transportation emissions, they make up the largest source of emissions in the United States. It was 27% in 2020.
Wow.
And passenger vehicles like the cars and the trucks that we drive, many of us drive at home and to work, are over half of these emissions. So this is an opportunity and a space where our individual choices can really make a difference if we make a change. And our goal in this space is to electrify everything as we go forward, but particularly vehicles are a critical solution when we're looking at how do we act on climate. So, and we know nobody's fooling ourselves that just converting everyone to more single occupancy electric vehicles, that's not going to solve the climate crisis, but it is an important place to start given how much this sector is on our emissions. And so,
Lindsay,
yeah,
can I jump in here? Because I just want to add a Vermont anecdote. So for those in rural America, and Vermont is definitely part of that rural America, an even higher number of emissions are dedicated to the transportation sector. And so I live in a very car-centric culture in Vermont because we're so dispersed. We don't have a big population. Most people live rurally, not in the city. And so, you know, in the 40% is our emission. It's our biggest carbon footprint. And so we've got a governor, Republican governor, Governor Phil Scott, who recently got the F-150, which is an electric. And I believe he's the first governor to do so as his primary vehicle. And so this Inflation Reduction Act comes at a critical time to help states like Vermont, whose biggest footprint is transportation, to electrify the fleet, both statewide and for the public, as Lindsay noted.
I love that, Michael. And I'll share a story from Fort Collins. You know, we're often known for being a bike, beers, and bands community. And when we think about our biking infrastructure, when I've talked to members of our Latinx or Hispanic community, they said, you know, I really appreciate Fort Collins' efforts around bikes. And I work 3 jobs all across this community. That's not realistic for me. What can work for me and my family? And so I love that electric vehicles are not the end-all solution, and vehicles are still the solution for so many people. So I love you bringing that in, Michael. Thank you for that.
Lindsay, I'm curious your take, because the critique is that this Inflation Reduction Act is just a giveaway to rich people to get more Teslas. You know, in terms of who owns EVs and who doesn't, is there a cultural gap here that in your current state analysis that's insurmountable, or do you see, you know, EVs becoming the everyday car for every American?
I think what's interesting is that we're at a tipping point right now. There's a recent Bloomberg article that we'll link to in the show notes that when countries hit this 5% of all sales going electric, that's a tipping point for scaling larger. And so we'll share that. And that could put us on track to have up to 25% of our new cars be fully electric by 2025. But you're absolutely right, Michael. So what we also know, a recent Reuters article, 2/3 of households who own electric or plug-in hybrid vehicles make over $100,000 a year. And we know that's unattainable to many Americans. And we know that the way that some programs are designed, which good news coming as a preview for later, the Inflation Reduction Act starts to address, the rebates only come after you purchase with your tax, when you file your taxes. And for some, that upfront cost is just insurmountable. And so we know that. There's some incredible work out there by entities. I highly recommend that our listeners check out the Greenlining Institute in California as one example. But we know we have a long road to hoe when it comes to making electric vehicle ownership accessible to everyone.
Yeah, I'll give a personal anecdote here. So I work for a nonprofit, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, and you know, I'm not working for a big private company making the big bucks. But when I moved to Vermont, I needed a truck for the farm, but I also bought a 2015 Nissan Leaf, and I bought it for $10,000 or $11,000, and there was some rebates then. Battery range wasn't great, and more recently I traded that in to lease a newer Leaf that has a longer range, a better battery, because Vermont is a big state and you have to do a lot of driving. And in the winter, when the battery range isn't as great, I needed longer range, and that's why I turned in my Leaf. But I think there's a lot of misperception out there that that EVs are only Teslas, and I don't think there's a whole lot of knowledge that there are some used affordable EVs, and Leafs are a great example of that, but there are other EVs out there. And so I do think there's a perception problem facing EVs because people think immediately of the Tesla and not of the affordable Leafs. And part of my education in Vermont was just telling people like, hey, yeah, I got this Leaf for $10,000. It's got great mileage. You should check it out, blah, blah, blah. I feel like EVs need a communications campaign just so that people don't simply associate them solely with Teslas, as has been the critique around the Inflation Reduction Act.
Absolutely. And when there's good news coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act for used EVs as well. This feels like a pretty good time to transition to what could the new default look like in this space, right, Michael? What do you think?
I love it. Way to transition. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So do you want to outline the Inflation Reduction Act elements?
Yeah, so there are so many great tax incentives and tax credits for all kinds of behavior change. And again, today we're primarily focusing on electric vehicles. But for a new electric vehicle, let's say you want to buy one, the tax credit is $7,500. Which is great. And for a used, it's $4,000, which is pretty substantial. So imagine that 2015 Nissan Leaf that I mentioned that I bought when I moved to Vermont, $4,000 goes into that kind of purchase. And so there are incentives to make the on-ramp a little easier for people who want a new default to be an EV. And so there's some great incentives. Hopefully you've heard about them already, but do check them out.
Yeah, and I think what's important for our listeners to know is that these tax credits were extended for a full decade. So there's a lot of certainty in the market for manufacturers that hasn't always been present, which makes me really excited because I know many of our listeners are experiencing some of the global supply chain issues. And so having certainty in this space is huge. I think the other thing, I know I have colleagues who just bought their first electric vehicle, and I've already gotten questions of, does this mean that I can't get my tax credit anymore? No. So here's the good news. So if you've already done that, if you did that before this act was signed just this week, then you can still claim the credit. Phew. So I'll just name that too for folks.
I love the sound effect. Yeah, that's great. Phew. Yes. Retroactive. Yeah. So in thinking about, when I think about the Inflation Reduction Act and all these new behaviors that are to become the new default for Americans, thinking about the culture wars that might get in the way or the communication obstacles that might get in the way. So, when I show off my Leaf in Vermont, usually it's compelling to people who may have not considered an electric vehicle. It's compelling for the following two reasons. One, it's cheaper to drive. We know that because, especially now, gas prices. But even when I first moved to Vermont 5 years ago, there were comments then from people who didn't have an EV and hadn't considered an EV that I was saving money that they weren't saving. And so this idea of energy savings, which we know is real, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, would help American families save up to $1,000 a year just on fuel pricing. We know over the life of a vehicle, you're going to save much more money with an EV than with a fossil fuel car. We know that. But then the other reason that folks in Vermont found compelling as we think about the new default and as we think about getting people into EVs, for a lot of folks, frankly, it was the acceleration. It was the torque. It was this idea that an EV would be more fun to drive. And I think there's this opportunity here as we get people to consider a new default and to consider getting into an EV and to consider taking advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, is that it's more fun to drive. Curious, Lindsay, have you ever been in an electric vehicle? Do you drive one now?
Yeah, we have the Kia Niros with the 2018. We got a plug-in hybrid electric because my husband travels a lot for work. And so we wanted to have the flexibility of a plug-in hybrid. Back in 2018, that was the best choice for us. A lot of things have changed since post-COVID. So we get about 26 miles on the charge, and then a 500 to 600 mile range after that, average 50 to 60 miles to the gallon. And so the last time I had to fill up in July, but the last time that I filled up before that was in January. So gas prices for our plug-in hybrid don't really impact our family, and it's a really great joy.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So in thinking about next step, man, I wish this was a call-in show, because it'd be fun to get people to call in and express why or why not they've gotten an EV. I mean, you even talked about it in terms of your partner and range and needing to have that reliability, which I think that anxiety, that range anxiety is real. And especially in states like Vermont, where it gets very cold and there may not be fast charging. And so how do you navigate the state quickly? I think that will continue to be a reality. And so as we think about this new default and getting people into EVs, is that the answer only? Or, as some of our colleagues have critiqued in the space around the Inflation Reduction Act, why are we not spending to make cities car-free or car-less, or really investing in mass transit? I remember reading an article just this week in the Washington Post about New York's MTA really struggling to find funding because of COVID, and how that's, and I know a lot of cities are facing this in terms of their mass transit. How do we ensure that mass transit has a long and healthy life? And I know as the federal government has invested in some of that in the past, which is good, but how do you think about this? What's your take, Lindsay, on this critique that we shouldn't be just getting everyone in cars? We should be instead helping our cities go car-free and really investing in mass transit.
I love that question. When I really think about climate action in general, or our sustainability world that we're building, there's no silver bullet. There's no one solution that will get us there. And so I absolutely agree. It's an all-in strategy that's needed. We need to be investing in transit. We need to be investing in electrification of our bikes. We're proud e-bike owners in our family too. We need to be looking at electric vehicles. The solution that is going to be best for everyone is going to be the solution that works best for them individually. What works for my family is going to be different for you and yours. And so I do believe that if we solely focused on electric vehicles, we'd be missing the boat. And so I wholeheartedly agree with that statement. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, some friends in Norway reached out just today, in fact, right before us recording the show, and they asked if there was anything innovative in the Inflation Reduction Act that they could mirror and replicate in Europe. And I thought it was an interesting question, because I don't necessarily see anything new or innovative in the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of creating new defaults and behavior change or systems change, because tax incentives and tax credits have been tried and true. We've used them for years. This is how we change systems and change behaviors, and that's a federal lever that's useful. And so in terms of anything innovative, I'm not seeing it. And that's from Norway, where, as you know, they've really transitioned quickly. They're the leader in electric vehicles. Most of the new purchases there are EVs, and they are the EV capital. Oslo is definitely the EV capital of the world, because they've incentivized it in similar ways, different financial levers, but they've incentivized it. But you've also got simultaneously these European capitals investing heavily in mass transit, and EVs are very expensive to buy. And so I think it's both and. Clearly, for states like Vermont and much of rural America, we want people driving electric if they can. And so this scale up, this incentivization of electric vehicles and electrification of transport, critical, absolutely critical. And, I was just looking at some previous federal legislation and how much we invested in public transit, and we haven't invested enough. So the infrastructure bill from last year, we invested about $100 billion in mass transit. That's insufficient. We need to double down on that investment, so that when we are in the big cities, people aren't driving, people are using mass transit. But again, this goes to the new default. People are going to switch if life is better. And so when mass transit isn't feeling safe, or isn't clean, or isn't fun, people are going to be more inclined to stay in their car, listen to their podcast, listen to this show, hopefully, as they're driving from point A to point B, maybe eating some food, maybe calling some friends. how do we get them out of their cars and into mass transit in the cities, especially, or in the regions where there is mass transit? But it is going to be only if it's a better ride. And so that's where the investment is critical, so that it is cleaner, it is safer, it is more fun, it is more enjoyable. And so it's a both and, in my take.
I agree with that. I also think what you've shared so far about Vermont and what I know to be true about Colorado is that getting to mass transit is unrealistic if we do not address land use, if we do not address the way that our communities are designed. And that's another podcast. But there are so many different connected spaces that local communities can work on in this space to really have an impact. And it's not just more funding for transit, which is not what I hear you suggesting. But there's many different interconnected systems that we're going to need to tackle.
Yeah, good call in terms of talking about the whole system. The whole system needs to be addressed, which for the cities that we work for and work with, making sure the departments are talking to each other, because it is a whole system that needs to be addressed. Here's a question for you, just a personal question, because you talked about the hybrid. What would it take, given the amount of driving that you all do? Because I know you also, as a family, take these great trips to these national parks. And if anyone is interested in checking out all the amazing travel that Lindsay does, do check out her Instagram, because they, as a family, go to some pretty amazing places. What would it take for you to switch off that hybrid and go full electric?
Yeah, Michael, my family is obsessed with camping. We had 73 nights last year, and we're at 46 nights already this year.
Amazing.
We've already had the discussion that we have a truck as well, and I hope that this truck is our last. We're actively watching where the electric truck area is going, and whether or not it has the tow capacity that we need for our camper and more. So I think everything's coming along, and I'm really excited about it. Our 2018 Kia has a 10-year or 100,000-mile warranty, and after 4 years, we're only at about 22,000 miles on it. And so we're planning to run that 10-year out, because we also believe that lowering our consumption is another important strategy too. So I'm convinced already that our next passenger vehicle will be fully electric as well.
One thing I'll just note, because I used to work in big cities primarily, and then I moved to Vermont, and Vermont is a car culture, as I already mentioned. I'm a big guy, so I'm almost 6'5". And what I've noticed in driving a lot more is that my body doesn't like it. I prefer to be walking everywhere. And I've noticed just in the last 5 years, all the driving, I don't fit well in most EVs. Like the Nissan Leaf is quite small for me. And so it's a bucket seat, which doesn't really work with my big frame. And so I'm keen to walk more just in transiting myself, because I know I'll be healthier as a result. And so that's something I think about when we think about getting people out of their cars and into mass transit, the health benefits that come from it. So we're about to close, and a couple more things we want to include here in this podcast. Every podcast we do, we are going to identify something we're exploring personally in terms of creating new defaults in our own lives, because we definitely want to walk the talk and process that here on the show too. So for me, a new default that I'm trying is that I used to buy 7th gen laundry detergent in the big plastic bottles. Shamefully, that continued up until recently, and that created a lot of plastic waste. Yeah, sure, maybe it's recycled, maybe it's not, whatever. And what created the new default for me was, wait for it, it was visiting my folks and learning that my mom and my sister had both transitioned to pods or sheets that you can just throw in the laundry machine versus getting the big plastic bottle. And so it was just learning that my mom and my sister were doing it and that they had transitioned that inspired me to finally do it. I knew that I needed to. I'd seen the commercials. I'd seen lots of commercials about it on social media. Just never transitioned. Should have years ago. Didn't. And it was family. It was that social norming around family, because in my family, I do the climate work professionally. And so I'm often bringing new ideas to the family, but for my family to outpace me, I was like, oh crap, I better change my behavior. So just really interesting to note that, and to be inspired by the family around you to encourage new behavior. How about you, Lindsay?
I love that, Michael. We know that loved ones and people that we trust are often the best messengers for change. We are testing out in our family at tabs for toothpaste as opposed to the tube of toothpaste. And so it comes in paper wrapping that all can be recycled. And it's just, you use a tab, you pop it in your mouth and you crush it and you brush away. And I love it. It's kind of a fun new experience at this point. My kids want to try it too. I haven't found a kiddo tablet toothpaste yet. So if anybody out there has one, I'd love to hear it. And so that's something that we're testing. And it's a small shift in our behavior that we're testing as well. Because we don't need, I love the saying, if we don't need one or two people doing this work perfectly, we need millions of people at the table. So that's what inspires me.
I love it. I love it. And you're right. We don't need the perfect. We need everyone in a process, figuring it out together. And it's a more compassionate approach anyway. So as we test out this new podcast, we'd love your comments in the post about what new topics we should consider, what should be our next episode as we're exploring new ideas. We want to be responsive to the news cycle too, in terms of critiquing what's out there and exploring the new default on a range of policy issues and things that the public is thinking about. And even with the Inflation Reduction Act, we could do deep dives into weatherization and solar and geothermal and battery storage. What is that? Things like that. So lots to talk about. Lindsay, do you have some thoughts on what we should tackle next?
No.
Yeah, that's good. But we will definitely come back with another episode because we're keen to have fun and just have these conversations about how to create new defaults in our behaviors, in our systems, so that we're greener, we're happier, we're healthier, better quality of life, all the things. Hopefully you enjoyed this first episode with me, Michael Shank, and Lindsay X.
Thank you all for listening, and let us know what you want to hear. This is really about you as our listeners.
Everyone, thanks so much for joining us. This has been The New Default.